Hello and welcome to Jim's Tabletop Wargaming. Previously we took a look at issue 1 of Combat Patrol magazine, assembling these two models in the process and giving a brief overview of Combat Patrol as a whole. While the models look good as they are, although unpainted, there is some room for improvement before we go further. I figured since this magazine subscription provides so many models and represents quite an investment of both time and money, it might be worth introducing some of the tools that I frequently use which will give you some great results and make the building process a little easier. This is entirely optional however, I just wanted to highlight some solutions to common issues and give you more understanding of the options available. The choice is yours. These are the basic tools from the last video. Clippers and a mold line remover, the clippers being an essential tool for removing the models from their sprues. I personally do not use the line remover tool as I prefer to use a knife and files. This gives me much better control compared to scraping with a fairly blunt and awkward tool. The line remover is safer in terms of causing damage to yourself accidentally, but as long as you are careful, there are much better alternatives. Files such as these come in various shapes, sizes and quality. I must have about 3 sets of these files, looking practically identical from various different companies, usually coming in a pack of 3 to 4 different shapes, making them ideal for different angles and surfaces that you may find on a model. Next on the list is a decent craft knife or scalpel, with a slightly weighted handle and interchangeable blades. This is my go-to method for removing excess plastic and gently scraping away mold lines. The narrow tip can get into much tighter places than the line remover tool. Obviously it's sharp, be mindful of where your fingers are while cutting, cut away from yourself, and keep the force applied to a minimum. If you push too hard you can damage the soft plastic of the model and potentially your own fleshy parts. There are a few different hand drills on the market aimed specifically at boring out the barrels of various weapons. Citadel has its own specific drill if you want the exact recommended bits, but companies such as Gale Force 9 and Army Painter offer cheaper alternatives. As I stated previously, I always use Tamiya glue for plastic models. This is just a personal preference really. Some nail files like this one can work really well. There is a frankly surprising amount of nail art products that work great for plastic models. This one has a polishing side which I find works best and gives a decent amount of control over sanding large flat areas without removing too much of the model. Sandpaper, specifically the 2000 grit, is exceptionally good for polishing areas smooth before painting. I also like to use the edges of the paper to remove difficult to reach mold lines from small, straight recesses like armor panels. Primers make the task of painting your models a lot easier by giving you a surface for paint to cling to, improving the overall quality of the paint finish by avoiding that awkward initial stage of getting your base coats to stick. There are many brands like Citadel, Army Painter, Colorforge and Vallejo coming in either a spray can or applied using an airbrush. I recommend using a spray can primer. I'll be going into more detail in a later video. One of the most important tips I can give is to make sure you can fully see the model you're working on. It seems obvious, but I have noticed a lot of people missing huge gaps in their base coats, posting grainy pictures where the only real light is from their phone camera. I use a headlamp so I can always see what I'm working on clearly regardless of my surroundings. There are loads of these available online across places like Amazon. If you have some decent lights at home or a table lamp, that will work fine. Just make sure you are not working in the dark. Next up we have some safety equipment I use regularly. When it comes to health and safety, you are responsible for your own well-being. Follow the safety guides and instructions packaged with any tools and chemicals you use. Goggles come in handy when spraying or priming, especially if you're working outside. I also use them when breaking down empty sprues, as sometimes the sharp plastic bits become projectiles. Also a good idea if you're working closely with strong chemicals. The respirator is used mainly for priming and spraying jobs. I can't tell you how many times I've primed a model only to blow my nose later and find the contents of that tissue is the same colour as my models. Disgusting and weird. This can also be great for any big sanding jobs. We're already filled with microplastics, so I don't intend to add to the problem. Gloves for protecting your hands during priming. This is mostly to stop me getting paint everywhere while waiting for stuff to dry. Some of these vinyl gloves are unsuitable for use with cleaning chemicals as it eats right through them, so for anything harsh I use the trusty marigolds. As I said, your safety is your own responsibility and it's entirely up to you what you use. I'm going to show you how I drill out the barrels of these storm bolters. Use the tip of a file to create a guide dimple in the center to keep the drill bit from slipping. Do not use your knife as it can break the tip as seen here. Use minimal force and go slowly, holding everything steady and keeping your fingers clear as much as possible. Usually, I would drill these out before assembly so I can use one of these jewelry vices to skewer the part. It makes it a little easier to get a perfectly centered hole when you are not relying on wobbly hands. There are quite a few rough spots left over from the build stage that the mold line remover could not quite fix, so I'm going to go over those now with a file, gently removing those unwanted bits of leftover plastic and smoothing out the marks left behind. I encountered a couple of small gaps where the individual parts meet. In this case they are small enough that I can fill them in with Tamiya by stroking it across the surface perpendicular to the gap. This seamlessly blends the two bits together by melting them across the tiny gap. Once dry, I can smoothly polish these areas with the fine grit sandpaper, removing imperfections left behind in the previous stages. With all of the tools I've just shown, be careful not to touch any fine or intricate details as to not accidentally remove them in the process. With that out of the way, let's take a look at issue 2, Von Ryan's Leapers. Just like the first issue, it has been broken down into 5 sections comprising the build section with assembly instructions for the Leapers kit, paint section with details on base coats, shading and highlighting, along with an overview of pacing via this magazine subscription with regards to painting. Read section with a very brief overview of the Imperium's founding and the factions within its ranks. An introduction to Vanguard and invasion swarms of Tyranids and their differing tactics. Collect section with the Von Ryan's Leapers naming tables and datasheet. Ending with the play section, introducing multi-model units, attacks per model, and allocating wounds. As for the models themselves, I followed the instruction to remove each part. Once freed, I then removed the excess plastic with my hobby knife, cutting away from myself and being as gentle as possible. Just slowly whittle away at the excess until it is small enough to start working on with the file. From here, just follow the previous method of filing and sanding the individual parts until you have all the parts ready to assemble. Apply your glue along the connection points. You don't need to drown it in glue, just a little along all areas that will touch each other. Put the parts together and apply a little pressure to ensure a tight connection. Once everything is assembled, check for any mistakes or gaps. These models are notorious for having noticeable gaps along the spines. Some of these will be small enough to fill with the Tamiya, just like with the Stormbolter. For anything larger, we will need additional methods to fully hide these gaps. There are a few different tools available for filling gaps, starting with the simplest method, liquid green stuff. As the name suggests, it's a ready mixed wet version of the green stuff modeling putty you can apply with a brush or a texture applicator. Next we have the ever popular sprue goo. For this, I took a half full Tamiya extra thin that I had been using and dropped in some chopped up bits of sprue. The sprue melts and makes a liquid plastic that can be easily applied with the brush applicator. Next we have 2 products that are very similar in nature, the regular version of green stuff and standard Milliput. Both require mixing before use and can be shaped using metal modeling tools to create a fast setting gap filler. They are versatile enough to be used in a wide variety of applications, with Milliput having a harder wearing surface and green stuff being closer to a soft plastic. You can even sculpt your own models and accessories with these, making them great for anyone wanting to customize your models further. First, I will show you how to use liquid green stuff, as it's probably the best for beginners. Take an old brush or stirrer that you don't mind damaging, get it wet with some water and begin stirring up the green stuff to make sure it's ready to apply. Sometimes it dries out, so you may need to introduce small amounts of water until it is like mine here. Once ready, we take a clump of it on our brush or applicator and push it into the gap. It does not need to be perfect, as we can polish it back down once dry, just avoid getting it into any details. It can easily be removed at this stage with water if you make any mistakes. Wait for it to dry. This can take quite a while depending on how much water you used. Inspect the area and if need be, apply another coat. Continue this until the gap is fully filled. Once satisfied, take your file or your sandpaper and gently remove any excess green stuff, smoothing out the area and blending it into the rest of the model. Now we will take a look at my personal favourite, the sprue goo method, on this spare leaper I have from another kit. First I take a small amount of goo and carefully apply it to the gaps, making sure not to use too much as it may leak into unwanted areas. Then I take the Tamiya and apply this over the top in order to stroke it flat and blend it in with the rest of the plastic. Leave to dry, and if you need to, you can sand and buff any imperfections out. As for the putty method, let me show you an extreme example with this rock grinder I'm working on. I have decided to remove a lot of the panel lines on this model because I hate myself and wanted to suffer, but the goo method has only made the model look melted and weird due to the sheer size of the height displacement around these gaps and all the flat panels. To correct this, I sand flat as many areas as I can without causing excess damage and turn to the trusty old green stuff. We start by cutting a piece to use and mixing the two colours together until we have a uniform green colour throughout. I highly advise gloves. Keep your fingers, tools and work surfaces wet, as this prevents the green stuff from clinging to them. It will not set or harden while damp, so keep it real, keep it moist. Shape the putty into whatever size and length you need and begin working it into the gaps of the surface. Once covered, begin to smooth it flat with your modelling tools. If you have any leftover putty, you can ball it up and create rocks for your bases rather than let it go to waste. It's best to push these into rough geometric shapes with odd surfaces to sell the realism of it being a rock. Leave to dry overnight and you should end up with something like this. Now we can sand away any excess, polish it smooth to create a seamless finish, being careful not to hit any details as we go. Now you can see the difference between the two sides of this vehicle and what an improvement this can make. This method is a lot more involved, but I wanted to include it anyway, as I felt it important for newcomers to have a basic grasp of what is available, so you can pick your own set of tools and methods for getting high quality finishes to your models. This video has been on quite a long tangent from the actual Combat Patrol magazine, and I am extremely behind on all the issues that have been released, so going forward I plan on speeding through several issues at a time to get back on schedule. Shout out to our sponsor The Warp. Check them out for discounts on Warhammer and to pick up any tools you might need. Like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Hello, Jim's Tabletop Wargaming, available for filling gaps. Before we go further, I'm going to show you how I get it where we touch each other in the dark. This is just a personal preference really. Basic grasp by stroking it hardened while damp until it is like mine here. Be mindful of where your fingers are, use minimal force and go slowly. I encountered a couple of small gaps, small enough that I can fill them in behind, push it into the gap. If you push too hard, you can damage the soft fleshy parts. It can break the tip wet gap filler, whatever size and length you need, getting it in tight connection. Continue this until the gap is fully filled, pacing, working it into the gap's tighter places and being as gentle as possible, slipping. Just slowly whittle away. Keep your fingers, tools and huge gap wet and gently speeding through, release. Small amount of goo, high quality finish, blow my goo everywhere. Once satisfied, you don't need to drown it in goo too much as it may leak into unwanted areas. Disgusting and weird. Hate myself, suffer.